All right, we're recording and we've got a few people who are joining the Zoom now. Let's see. We are live on Facebook, so good morning, everybody. It's 10:30 here in quarantine at my house, the Sternberg residence, and in working from the North Shore, I have with me my partner, Keith Naccari, who has spent a whole lot of time learning about the new COVID stimulus bill, which has just passed Congress on Monday. An interesting thing happened last night where President Trump is now threatening to possibly veto this legislation. So obviously everything that we say here could be changed by a presidential veto or by Congress going back and changing this bill. But one of the things that I saw this morning that I thought was really interesting, Keith, was Nancy Pelosi actually put out a tweet that said that she agreed with the president, that the president and that Nancy Pelosi agree that we should be sending $2,000 to individuals and not $600. So that would be an interesting development. But we don't think that the business provisions of this bill are going to change that much. And so we're going to go ahead and get started with our Wednesday web chat here. We're glad to be back live here at Sternberg, Naccari and White. My partner, Keith Naccari, is a tax lawyer. He practices out of New Orleans and Baton Rouge and has an LLM in taxation from New York University. And so, Keith, you've spent a lot of time trying to educate yourself on this bill. Why don't you give an overview, if you can, to our viewers and the folks who have joined us live here on what this bill is going to do for their business?
Sure. There have been some very interesting developments in the bill. It really is separated into two groups, right? We have our individuals who are going to be helped by the extended unemployment and potential stimulus checks. They're going to have similar restrictions that the CARES Act had. And then the real meat and potatoes of it is changes and modifications to the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, which I know most businesses were able to take advantage of under the CARES Act. There have been both amendments to that program, but also there's an expansion of the program. And then at the end of this, we'll talk about the tax ramifications and some clarification that was made in this bill and how we can kind of piece all of these COVID bills together to really form a great plan that helps a business move forward, right? So some of the changes that were made to the PPP under the CARES Act in this bill have been an expansion of forgivable expenses, right? So we have an expansion in that definition to now cover covered property damage costs, covered supplier costs, and covered worker protection expenditures. The last two are probably the most useful. In those, we see covered supplier costs will be someone had a contract prior to February 15th of 2020, and in that contract they have a minimum purchase they're required to buy, right? Those are now potentially forgivable expenses moving forward because they're recognizing you may not have had the need for those supplies, but you had a legal obligation to purchase them. Similarly, we look at the covered worker protection expenditures. This has a very expansive definition. This can be anywhere from hand sanitizers to shields that you'll see in a grocery store, to even capital costs for a restaurant expanding its outdoor seating to comply with state regulations or federal health guidelines. This expanded definition is going to apply to both the first draw from the PPP program and the second draw that's created by this new bill. It should help get clients who are just shy of 100% over that threshold, so none of these loans will be owed back. In addition, they're recognizing that when the PPP program first started, it was kind of a mad dash, right? The program originally did not have enough funding and ran out of funding fairly quickly. It was refunded, but as a result of that, the regulations weren't necessarily in place, even for how much someone could apply for. As a result, some people didn't maximize what they could have borrowed under the first program. And there was no way for them to go back and amend that original loan. There now is. So this bill has created a way to go back and amend your first loan without necessarily going into your second draw, right? So that brings us into probably the biggest piece of this, which is the creation of the second draw. So there's a potential for a second round of PPP under this new bill for some businesses. They do have a new requirement that you now have to show a 25% decrease in either quarter 1, 2, 3, or 4 of 2020. One caveat is if you're using quarter 4 of 2020, you have to be applying after January 1st because they do want to see a full quarter. With that, we're going to be comparing those quarters to the same quarter in 2019, but they do want to see at least a 25% decrease. For businesses that were shut down, for the original 2.5 months, that should be no problem. And for quite a few businesses, even if they were able to stay open, they'll have seen a drop off. Similar to the last calculation, we're going to look at payroll. And we're going to get a monthly average. Either you can use your monthly average from 2019, or we can use a monthly average from the prior 12 months. We're then going to take that payroll and multiply it by 2.5 for most categories. We do have an exception for companies that have a NAICS code of 72. This is going to be mostly our hospitality industry companies. Recognizing that these industries have been hit harder than most, Congress has increased the amount that they can apply for in the second draw and allowing them to multiply that average monthly payroll by 3.5. Similarly, we have different calculations and different periods for, seasonal businesses where, we'll pick a 12-week period between February of 2019 and February of 2020. Or for new businesses, again, we'll pick a 12-week period, and we're still trying to get to that monthly, average monthly payroll. These calculations can be a little cumbersome, and the bank is not going to be underwriting these. So they may go through the calculation somewhat with you, but you're actually signing saying you understand the calculations and have done them properly. A lot of this, is more likely to come out a couple of years from now when they've audited some of these loans. In addition, there's been a simplification of the forgiveness process. So for loans under $150,000, the paper requirement and the proof requirement has been lowered tremendously for both the first and second draw. There have been some simplifications even for those over 150,000. And when we say, $150,000 threshold, we're looking at the first and second draw separately. We're not looking at those combined.
So Keith, you're saying that if a business got less than $150,000 in the first draw of the PPP, mm-hmm. then the business can get their forgiveness even easier, because it was going to be pretty difficult to get the forgiveness, right?
Yeah, so it's an easier and more streamlined process getting the forgiveness from the bank. However, there are still some audit requirements. So having all of that paperwork together that was expected for proof that the funds were spent as they were supposed to be spent is still really burdensome, right? But it's a necessity, because if you get caught in an audit without that paperwork, you have some real problems on your hand, right? A best case scenario, you may owe back the loan. Worst case scenario, you could be accused of fraud, right? for
And
misappropriation of funds.
that's why it's really important to work with an accountant and an attorney as necessary, right?
Correct. And especially for those over 150,000, it's even that much more important.
We've had an interesting accounting question come in just now. Can you apply for a PPP loan, the second PPP loan, using accrual basis accounting if you report to the IRS using cash basis? You say your circumstances change during the year, like every business has this year.
Sure.
Can you change your tax basis?
So the answer to that is we're not sure yet. They have 45 days to come out with regulations again, similar to the first round of PPP. Speculation is yes, as long as you can provide as long as you can get back to that calculation and provide a reconciliation. But that's speculative right now. Similarly, these sheets that the SBA are going to create to simplify this 150,000 or this process for those under 150,000. The SBA has 10 days from when the bills signed into law to create those sheets as well. So a good bit of this is still speculative. We do have definitive timelines this time for when we'll know. But again, they ironed out a lot of the rules and a lot of the issues that they had with the first PPP, and a lot of that the guidance will apply unless overruled with new regulations. But we are kind of going to be playing without the rules again for a good bit of the application period.
Yeah, because what I remember about that summertime was that we were kind of a mad dash. We were trying to get all the information together, but we didn't know what information we were actually going to need. We just were guessing, right?
Sure. And, there were certain things that had to be worked out, like how are we considering owners' pay? And, the regulations came out and treated an entity with an S election that's paying their owner payroll versus an entity with a partnership election that's, simply paying their partners, their guaranteed payments or distributions. And they treated them very differently. And initially, we didn't necessarily know that that was going to be the case. That's one of the reasons why they're now allowing people to go back and amend that that initial part, because it affected, that payroll cost affected how much they were able to borrow. So that's why they're allowing people to go back and borrow more now. And those answers we have, right? We have a plethora of regulations from the PPP program, and this is really amendments and expansions of that program. So we still know we can follow the majority of those regulations.
So this bill allows businesses to go back and amend their first PPP application to see if they can get more money.
Correct.
And the other thing that I've heard a lot of business owners talk about or be very concerned about is this idea that PPP money would be taxed and you couldn't offset your expenses against the PPP money, and that was going to give people a big tax bill at the end of the year. Have we dealt with that in this bill?
Sure, and that gets us into kind of our third area of the presentation. So there was a lot of clarification on tax issues in this bill. The original CARES Act stated that the forgiveness in the PPP program and the EIDL advances were going to be exempt from being taxable income. The IRS accepted that, but then came out with revenue rulings and proclamations that they basically did an end around. They said, okay, we won't recognize this as revenue. However, the expenses that are paid using these funds are not going to be deductible. That effectively taxed the money. This legislation is making it very clear the legislative intent all along was for the income to be excluded and for that exclusion not to affect the deductibility of the expenses. That is a huge, huge piece that a lot of people don't necessarily realize was in the bill. I mean, that could be one of the more important sections in the bill, because if not, you take, the average size of the PPP loans under the CARES Act was just over $100,000. All of these entities would now have an additional $100,000 in income to pay taxes on without this provision. And it's another reason why it's vitally important that some form of this gets passed and, placed into law, because we are coming up on the end of the year and it's hard to plan around, right? Additionally, to clarifying the taxability of the PPP and the EIDL advance money, there were some extensions of some credits that are very useful to businesses. So under the original Families First Coronavirus Response Act, there were really nice credits that were put in for paid sick leave and family leave for people who either contracted the coronavirus or had symptoms of coronavirus, or were taking care of a family member who had those. These credits were set to expire and have now been extended through the end of March of 2020. Most of the benefits in this stimulus package pretty much go through either the middle or end of March. We would anticipate by the time they wane, there potentially could be another package. The other important thing, and we have to really go back to a benefit of the CARES Act that has been ignored or hasn't been given the attention it probably should, is the CARES Act provided for a net operating loss carryback of 5 years. When you combine that with the new proclamation that this additional PPP money and the expenses associated will be deductible, we're going to have quite a few businesses who are probably going to experience losses. They can turn these losses into actual cash by amending prior returns. Great way to provide cash flow for your business with some very minimal steps. But it's important that it's planned properly. And again, that's an area where, an attorney and a CPA become a vital component of it.
Right. So they've provided a lot of tax advantages for businesses that require those businesses to, a lot of businesses thought they could do the PPP on their own at the beginning of when the first CARES Act was passed. And we've seen a lot of those businesses come to lawyers like us and other lawyers and ask questions because they're confused. But, I think that it's really important to get the message out here that first off, this isn't a bill that's been signed by the president yet, right? We're still waiting to see if he'll sign it. And, if he does sign it, there's going to be a lot of revenue rulings and regulations that have to come out before anyone can access any of this money.
In keeping in mind too, those who, and quite a few of our clients, we'd recommended holding off on their applications for forgiveness, right? One of the reasons was exactly what's happened in this bill, in that there have been modifications that favor the business owner to the program, but are not available to individuals who already have had a decision on the forgivable, on how much of their loan is forgivable. You can't go back and refile an application for forgiveness, right? But moving forward, it's important to note that a lot of these changes apply both to the first and second draw, including the easier applications for forgiveness.
So let's talk about individuals for a second. We had a question about service industry workers and gig workers who've had to kind of make ends meet with a bunch of different jobs. What kind of expanded unemployment benefits are we expecting?
Yeah, so we're expecting unemployment benefits to be extended through March 14th of 2021 at $300 per week for the federal supplement. So that's on top of the state unemployment, right? And this is important for both our employees, but also understanding that this federal supplement's potentially available to business owners as well, right? If your business has been shut down and you're unemployed, traditionally you wouldn't be considered an unemployed individual, right? Like you wouldn't qualify for unemployment benefits because it was your company, right? You had some choices in whether you continue or not. And quite honestly, it's just hard to prove when somebody has shut down their company, right? But these federal benefits are now potentially available under the expanded definition.
So for somebody who's a consultant or a gig worker, they're going to be able to be eligible for these benefits?
Potentially for the federal.
Okay, great. We have a lot of nonprofits that have joined us today, or 501c6s. Does this bill do anything for them?
It does. There are particular sections in the PPP or particular subsections in the PPP section that have expanded into the nonprofit world and actually provide very specific guidelines for nonprofits. A nonprofit should, do a consultation because it's very different than the rest of the program.
We just had a question come in about if an individual or business has already received PPP in the first round, does this bill give access to additional funding? I think the answer to that is yes.
Potentially, yes.
Okay.
So there's an extra hurdle, right? You have to have that, you have to be able to show a 25% decrease in revenue in any quarter, and it does have to be actual quarters. So it's Q1, 2, 3, or 4 in 2020 compared to 2019. As long as you can show that, the business should be able to qualify. Now, they have reduced some of the employee numbers, so it's now reduced to a 300 employee number, and a lot of the industry-specific employee numbers have gone away.
Right.
We do have some particular carve-outs that have different rules. News organizations is a good example. Restaurants is a good example. But the eligibility rules have changed from PPP, but for most people, as long as they can get past that 25% decrease threshold, they should be able to qualify for additional funding.
How about seasonal work, Keith? If somebody's a seasonal worker, like maybe they have a Christmas business or a summer
Sure.
business.
So seasonal workers have a different calculation, same basic requirements with a 25% decrease. And that's why it's quarter specific, because seasonal work should be cyclical. But the amount they qualify for is different, right? So when we're getting an average payroll, it obviously wouldn't be fair to a seasonal company to take a 12-month average, right? Because they're going to have periods where it's just less. So what they're allowed to do is pick a 12-week period to get that monthly average payroll.
What about EIDL loans? The economic impact disaster loan, right? People got those before the PPP really came out, and then they kept applying for them. Is there anything in this bill that affects the EIDL loans that have already been given out?
Yeah, so in particular, one of the bigger areas is the EIDL advances. The EIDL advances under that same section concerning the deductibility of expenses for PPP money include EIDL advances as well, since those were grants.
Okay, so it's deductible, but it's not necessarily forgiven.
Well, the advance was more of a grant.
Right, that's right. It was a $10,000 advance, right? A lot of businesses got that $10,000
potentially up to 10,000, 1,000 per employee. Yep.
Right. Okay, is there anything else that we need to get out there for everybody? I think we've gone through all of our questions and we're at 22 minutes. So what else should we talk about, Keith?
Yeah, this was the large part of the new bill, right? There's obviously funding for vaccine distribution included in here. There's funding for state and local governments included in the bill, which should, ease some of the strain that we're seeing, quite frankly, that we're seeing quite a bit in New Orleans, right? So there are those programs. What I will say is we do expect tremendous regulation to come out over the next month and a half with these. And I do believe this additional round, the second draw for the Paycheck Protection Program is going to be underfunded. I think it's going to be a mad dash again. So I think contacting and being ready with how much you're going to ask for, how much you think you qualify, having your documentation in place. So when your bank tells you they're now processing loans, you need to be first in line. So people shouldn't be waiting until their bank's contacting them to say, hey, this second draw is available. Right now, what you can be doing is you can be, consulting your CPA and attorney. You can be getting together your documents, showing your quarter by quarter comparisons. You can be getting together your payroll reports. All of these things are things that we're pretty positive you're going to have to show to qualify for the loans. And the last thing you want is to have a 2-day delay because you're waiting on your CPA to provide this report or bookkeeper, or your CPA or attorney are now busy and they're going to calculate how much you can borrow, but you're at the back of the line because everybody else was contacting them 5 days ago. The timing isn't great for that, right? We're heading into the holiday season right now. Generally between now and the end of the year, they have quite a few people who take off, but if you're a business owner, you need to be jumping on this right away if you think you qualify.
Well, thanks, Keith. That's a good point. And I think after this call, you and I should maybe talk about how we can get our second PPP loan started, right? We got to take our own advice, right?
We're already on it. We are set to go.
Okay, see,
So,
there you go. There you go, Internet. That's what you got to do. You got to get started on it. Keith's already started on it. So,
absolutely.
Any closing words, Keith?
No, if this bill isn't any less complicated than the original CARES Act was, it does provide some tremendous benefit. And, if anybody has any questions that are particular to their company, we're happy to help. Just reach out.
Right. And so, we haven't done a Wednesday web chat in a while because we've kind of been in recovery mode lately, but we're going to keep having regular web chats to talk about these regulations as they come out to help you make good decisions for your business. But you can find all of our content at SNW.LAW, or you can go find us on Facebook. You may be watching us on Facebook right now at facebook.com/SNW Law Firm. Again, SNW.LAW is the best way to get us. We've got an Ask a Question form. Keith and I are always available. He's Keith at SNW.LAW, and I'm Scott at SNW.LAW. We really appreciate everybody for joining us. And those of you who are going to watch the recorded version later, we hope you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thanks everybody. Guys.